Yeah, so Benjamin, thank you for your the insight you gave us about South Africa, and I guess I must just, I'm not a member of the MIFF. They have hired me in to pose the questions, and the reason why they want it is to put light on the question: is Israel an apartheid state? Yeah. Can Israel be compared to the apartheid rule in South Africa in your youth and when you grew up and when you worked in the Rand-Daily Mail and during the greatest part of your life, when South Africa really was a state which was divided by racial divisions. So you went, as you told us, you went to England in the mid-1980s. Your paper was closed. You went to England, but then you immigrated to Israel in 1997. Yeah. And why did you do that?
Well, I was in Fleet Street. I was one stage chief foreign sub-editor of The Independent. We went to Boston for a year. I was editing an international paper, and I got to know a rabbi in London, Rabbi Mickey Rosen, and he went to live in Israel, and he founded a modern Orthodox synagogue and learning center there, and we'd been working together in London to some extent, and he said to me, come to Israel and let's start a dialogue center. And this was at the end of the 90s, when things looked hopeful. So we raised some seed money from the Rothschild Foundation, and we went to Israel. And for 12 and a half years, I ran a dialogue center, trying to bring together Jews and Jews, which is very necessary there, Jews and Christians, Jews and Muslims, and then increasingly a lot of Israeli-Palestinian work. And the lesson I applied was a very fundamental one I'd learned in South Africa. Make contact, create trust. As simple as that. On the basis, if you don't know people, you can't work together, you can't trust each other, you can't live together. That was what I learned in South Africa. That's what I try to learn, not very successfully, as you've noticed, in the Middle East, in Israel. I did that for 12 and a half years until, unhappily, Mickey died young, and since then I've been writing. Let me say this. Living in South Africa, in moral terms, there was no problem. It was totally clear. It was good versus evil. You had to decide. In deciding that you're against evil, the only real issue was the extent to which you opposed. Mandela put your life literally on the line. Various forms of resistance. Most people didn't resist because that's the nature of people. And I took decisions on that basis. Living in Israel has been totally difficult and very different. Because in moral terms, it's not the same. It's a far more complex situation. I referred earlier to the bombings. We didn't have that in South Africa. In Israel, you've got to contend with this. Is this a freedom struggle? Is it terrorism? How do you relate to it? How do you relate to what the Israeli government is doing from day to day? A lot of which runs totally counter to what I fought for with every atom of my being in South Africa, like detention without trial, confiscation of land, all sorts of issues. Every day I find when I meet people or I read the newspapers or whatever, I have to make a moral judgment or try and make one. A lot of the time I just don't know what to do. But I'm morally challenged all the time in a way that just didn't happen in South Africa. Now, the apartheid accusation against Israel is a very serious one. And I straddle, as you gather, both societies. And if it was true, Israel would deserve to be condemned it would deserve to be driven out from the world of nations. So I spent a lot of time examining it, and I've written a book on it. It came out in paperback last year, Drawing Fire, investigating the accusations of apartheid in Israel. And I'll try to do my best to look at all of it. And my basic conclusions, firstly, in regard to Israel proper, Israel from the 1948, basically 67 boundaries, there's an Arab minority of about 22%. They have full citizenship rights, same rights as me. In particular, for example, national insurance, which is compulsory for everyone, and you get the same rights. Medical aid, labor unemployment, everyone is exactly the same. They can travel wherever they want to in Israel. They can basically buy property, but there's social conventions. There's a social discrimination, which makes it difficult for Arabs to live in, quote, Jewish areas, but they do. But there is also discrimination. And this is important to understand. When I was writing this book, and I was in South Africa at one stage, a very important leader of the community there asked to meet me. He had heard I was writing this book, and he said to me, please don't express any criticisms of Israel. I said, well, are you crazy? Why not? Why? He said, because our enemies will make use of them. I said, well, look, this is a journalist's dilemma, as you know. How much criticism do you express of friends, for example? And I said, look, that's a journalist's dilemma. You can't play at being God, that if you do this, you say this, someone's going to use it for that purpose. You can't do that, because you'll never write anything. And I said, I've got to tell the story as I see it. And people will make use of the book as they see appropriate. And to me, it's also the honest thing to do. Israel, those of you who know the country, is an incredible place. It's a place of the most wondrous achievements. In the 70 years nearly, what Israel has achieved in terms of education, absorption of people, medicine, you name it, in every single field. Water alone, world leader, the second Silicon Valley in the world, amazing achievements, and bonding people together in many ways, although not all that successfully. Amazing achievements. And yet, it's not perfect. It's got tremendous problems, some of which we deal with well, others, in my view, we deal with badly. One of the joys is I can say and write things in Israel without having any problems whatsoever. In South Africa, they took my passport away. I wasn't able to travel out of the country for 5.5 years. And for years after, they'd give me a passport for 3 months at a time. I'd once a passport valid only for the United Kingdom for 3 months. I couldn't go anywhere else because they didn't like what I was writing. Well, in Israel, and I was followed all the time there. I was followed by the security police, harassed all the time for years. There's nothing like that in Israel. And that's one of the joys of Israel, one of the strengths. Although our democracies, but I'm very critical of the government, and I'm entitled to be, as many Israelis are. I'm totally against the occupation. Some people are in favor. I'm not, and I can say so freely. But it's a complex country. But with the Arab minority, for example, part of it is historical. Going back to the beginning of the 20th century, the Jewish National Fund was created to buy land for Jews, to be held in perpetuity, to be rented and sold only to Jews. That was part of the Zionist struggle. And by the time 1948 came and the independence, the JNF owned about 6% of the land. And then negotiations were done. Land was handed to the government, to the JNF. It ended up about 6%, 7% of the land in Israel is privately owned. The churches owned a lot of land. The Knesset, the parliament, stands on land owned, I think, by the Greek Orthodox Church. It's leased from the church. Other land is owned by the religious authority, the Waqf, the Muslim authority. other land by private families like the Rothschilds. The rest of it, basically, most of it, is leasehold. Do you have that phrase in Norway? Leasehold means you don't own the land, or the state owns the land, you have a 49, 99-year lease on it, but you don't own the land. Well, of that 93% of state-owned land, the JNF has 13%.
The who?
The Jewish National Fund.
Jewish National Fund, yeah.
So 13% of the land, in theory, cannot be sold or rented to anyone else but Jews. In fact, it's not watertight. Deals are done behind the scenes. Land is exchanged. It's rural land, by the way, not city land. But this is a discrimination. And it has a knock-on effect, because Arab villages have been unable to expand, so they're crowded. They can't get land for light industry, so they can't get better taxes. So you have a series of knock-on events. Schooling suffers. The standard of living suffers. Everything suffers because of this knock-on effect. Well, this provision is an anachronism. It'll disappear one of these days. They're interested in holding it in place and so on. But while it lasts, it is a discrimination. Second one is army service. And this is because in my lifetime, in lifetimes of many people here, there was a horrible civil war. 1948, and Israel's been under attack ever since. You've got a relic of that. Arabs do not do compulsory military service. Jews do. Not all Jews. The religious, about 10-15% are exempted. But otherwise, men do 3 years, and women 2-3 years if they're in a fighting unit. Compulsory. Arabs don't do it. Except not all Arabs are the same. The Druze are conscripted. And they're generals, they're Druze generals and colonels, right at the top. The Bedouin volunteer, and they're excellent as trackers. A story about 6 months ago, big step forward for the Bedouin. The first Bedouin had been appointed a tank commander. And that's important. That's a Jewish crew, and in confines of us, in a little steel tank, there's the commander.
And the Bedouin is a Muslim? Is a Muslim?
Yes, oh yes,
Yeah.
yes. Druze are also Muslims, different form. Caucasians who come from somewhere in Europe, there's a tiny group, they're conscripted also. But the massive of Arabs are not conscripted. Now this, of course, is a good side. They miss 3 years of military service. The bad side is they miss out on the perks that go with military service.
The advantages.
Yeah. Easier entry to university. They resent being held back because you get someone who's not going to do military service, you can let him go and do medicine at the age of 18 when someone's doing his army service has got to wait till 21. You've got problems between people at this level. Creates all sorts of problems. Now, this is gradually changing also, very gradually, because what the government is offering is saying, okay, do national service. Work in hospitals, work in community centers. You'll get the same pay as non-combat soldiers, which is lower than combat soldiers, and you'll get the same perks. The Arab leaders are fighting it. They say this is part of Judaizing the Arab community, which I don't quite understand, but that's what they say. It's now in the terms of a few thousand a year, slowly going up, because it's to the advantage, obviously, of people to do this national service, and it's part of being part of Israel. These are carryovers from the past, which will go away eventually. There is social discrimination. Have you got racism in Norway? We've got racism in America. We've got racism. We've got rabbis who put out a letter, more than 100 rabbis sign it, calling on Jews not to rent or sell property to Arabs. Well, that's racist. I'm totally against it. So we've got racists. It's part of a normal society. So there's discrimination in that respect. But otherwise, if I can give an example, a personal one, it so happens in the last year I've been extremely ill from June last year up to May this year. I had cancer, very serious cancer, and I was treated at Hadassah in Kerem, one of the major hospitals in Israel. My doctors, nurses were a combination of Jews and Arabs. My nurses were Jews and Arabs. They were religious, their heads covered, Muslims and Jews, and they were secular. 95% of them, as far as I was concerned, were angels. And I had Palestinian patients in the same ward or elsewhere. If the spirit and the practice of the hospitals could be carried over to the society as a whole, Israel would be a total paradise. We've still got to get there. But in the hospitals, this most intimate of human encounters, to find that, at 2 o'clock in the morning, if you're in pain, and I ring the bell and the nurse who comes in happens to be an Arab, whom by then I knew, the moment I saw him, I knew I'd be fixed up within 30 seconds. He was the best of the lot. So I couldn't care less he was a Jew or an Arab. He was an angel who was coming in to relieve me from pain. That was all. And that under apartheid was unknown. It couldn't exist. It was inconceivable. So anyone who says to me, Israel is apartheid, I say, for God's sake, do you know what you're talking about? And the contrast, the description I gave you earlier, I mean, it doesn't exist. There is racism, sure. The West Bank is different. Gaza is another story. It's a problem all on its own. No one can ever solve Gaza. It's got built-in problems that are just beyond belief almost. Because no one wants it. Israel offered Egypt Gaza back again, didn't want it. And one of the things, by the way, which is little referred to, we're always criticized for our blockade of Gaza, and I'm against the blockade. Egypt has an even tougher blockade. We let through 400 trucks a day of food, medicines, everything. Thousands of people come through every year. Egypt seals the border. They let it open I saw a story the other day. They're going to open it now a couple of days every few weeks or so on. Because as much as we might be against Hamas, Egypt is even more so, because Hamas is Muslim Brotherhood. Egypt has a war going on in the Sinai Desert, and it accuses Hamas of being involved in it. Egyptian soldiers are being killed all the time, and Egypt hates Hamas, and has got the place like a vice, like that. Far beyond us.
But you described the situation for the Arabs in Israel. But how is it actually to be an Arab on the West Bank?
That's a different story.
Because I guess most of the accusations about apartheid is directed towards the situation on the West Bank.
Yes and no, until you start offering arguments, and then the critics tend to back off and say, well, not really Israel, but it's there. It's there. It doesn't exist. It is there. The West Bank is an occupation. I am one of the many Israelis who is totally opposed to it. It's cruel, it's a tyranny, because that's the nature of an occupation. This country's been under occupation, and you know enough about your history to know what it's like. We are not remotely like the Nazis. There's nothing remotely like it. But an occupation means military control of another people, and it can never be pleasant. It has to be cruel in its very nature, and it is cruel and unjust. Why we got it? Well, it goes back to 1967 when we struck preemptively because we believed we were going to be attacked. It goes to 1973 when we were hit without knowing it was going to happen. Terrible wars and the need for security. And at that time, the West Bank was a necessary buffer between us and Jordan for tanks. Today, tanks are almost irrelevant. It's rockets. But you still have that psychology of needing a buffer. It's developed from 1967. It started off with the emotional feelings of needing to go back to areas which had been conquered and wiped out by the Arabs in 1948. The biggest massacre of the war, by the way, was against Jews in Quartz Etzion on the West Bank. About 160 people were killed there. The comparable massacre, we all did massacres. It was the most terrible war, close up. with, at the beginning, no mercy shown on either side. Then things got rather better in relations between people. But it was an ugly war, and since then, messianic feelings have developed. This was the cradle of Jews around Hebron, and a whole messianic Zionist ultra-right thing has developed. It's now become very much a right-wing Zionist effort. The numbers of Jews in Israel who are against the occupation varies. It used to be up about 70%. It's now dropped to about 50, in the 50s, 60s. It's still very much a political issue. The right wing want to extend the occupation. The people outside the right wing want to get out of there. My view is we brutalize the Palestinians and we brutalize ourselves. We've got our young soldiers who are there in occupation. They're youngsters, conscripts. They're at a checkpoint. Someone walks towards them. They say, stop, in Hebrew or Arabic, whatever it might be. The person doesn't hear them, doesn't understand. Soldiers scared because people get stabbed, suicide bombing, so he shoots. And it's someone who didn't hear, or is hard of hearing or something, and you have a tragedy. That's one of the things, one of the aspects of an occupation that can happen. Other things are crueler, the control of people. It's not apartheid, though. That is the distinction. It's unjust, it's a tyranny, everything you want to say about it. But the main thing about apartheid was what I call the intentionality. The white rulers set out to create a system of discrimination, of white domination. That was the whole purpose. And this whole panoply of laws and regulations were built up over the years to enforce it. You don't have anything like that. This is a response, in my view, a misplaced response to a security need. It's called the apartheid wall. Well, it isn't. Firstly, the whole barrier is only a small part, is an actual wall, which is a terrible sight, 9 meters high. But most of it is barbed wire, fences, electronic sensors, and all sorts of things. It was originally conceived because we had a huge number of suicide bombings. And we were in Jerusalem at that time, and that's a terrifying thing to live through. When I read about Baghdad and Kabul and all those other places, I just feel total empathy for them. To live with suicide bombings, I must tell you, especially with your children, and you never know when they go out what's going to happen. On a bus, you know, you get used to the police, the siren, the wail of the police cars. If it just goes away, it's okay. You hear another siren, you know straight away, trouble. And then the sirens really go off. And I think, I scream at my Palestinian friends, you guys are crazy, man. Look at what the ANC did, what I explained. Took a decision, no civilian violence, and it paid off. And I said, what the Palestinians had done with suicide bombings, they drove most Israeli Jews to the right. That's where our right wing really developed, because people become terrified. And every crazy Iranian dictator or Syria or wherever says we're going to eliminate the Jews, adds to the right-wing fears. It's straight fear and builds prejudice. If people say, we're going to kill you, what is your response? The Jews in the ghettos went quietly. Not today. We'll kill you first. And it justifies everything. Security is the big word. Once you say security, you can do what you like virtually. Well, within limits anyway. But basically, that's what drives people. And the suicide bombings, and the stabbings that go on, and the car rammings, all the things you're reading about in Europe and so on, we've gone through them all. And the effect has been to drive people to the right and to support the most right-wing government we've ever had. And yet, there's also a contradictory side. We have a right-wing government, but as far as I know, it's doing more to try and upgrade the Arab community than any other previous government. It's promised millions. I saw a report last week. We got high tech, shorter people. 1,500 Arabs. There's a special program created to draw in 1,500 young Arab men to be specially trained for high-tech jobs, high-paying high-tech jobs. That's a right-wing government. There's a bad story in the Negev with the Bedouin. In some ways, it's a tragic modern story. Here are pastoral people that are accustomed to graze, move on, graze, and so on. They've got modernity. They've been crushed. Government wants to build towns. Bedouin are resisting. I saw a story the other day. There's one group, the buildings they put up have been destroyed 100 times by the police, and they keep coming back and building again. They're determined. They're going to lose eventually. A city's going to grow up there. But this is one of the transitions of a complex society. You know, you must have gone through this 100, 200 years ago in Norway. The same sort of basic problems of people. But the occupation, as I say, I'm against it. But to compare it with apartheid, I was saying the apartheid wall, for example, it was built for security, to keep out the suicide bombers. Then people got greedy. They started using it to seize land. And if you go and look at the wall and the barrier, you'll see it snaking around. There's a Jewish house there. It suddenly does a little twist to include it on the Israeli side. But security, not apartheid.
But what do you really think could be done today to eliminate the conflict? Is it that easy that Israel could just withdraw to the borders from 1967 and everything would be fine? What would happen if Israel withdrew to the borders from 1967, which has been the claim, what the Arab side has said for years now?
I think the first thing is to negotiate with each other. And I think that's the Oslo Accords, which of course, Norway, in Oslo, in 82, 83, there's a lot of feeling against them in Israel today. They blame for all the suicide bombings and so on. I don't agree. I think the Oslo Accords were a remarkable achievement, and remarkable that this country helped in that. Because I think for the first time, we recognized each other's existence. Israel basically recognized the right of the Palestinians to a state, and basically Palestinians recognized the existence of Israel. That was the turning point. Unfortunately, both sides screwed up. On the Arab side, they stepped up the violence. That was the act of madness. And on our side, we created settlements. And we destroyed, with every settlement, we undermined the chance of going forward to an agreed solution, which in my view, and the view of the whole world virtually, is a two-state solution. I still believe in it. But we've got to get there. And all sorts of fancy plans. Until you get agreement on both sides, you're not going to get it. And the problem is a lot of words. You'll find we've got to meet and talk. Make contact, create trust. So you'll find the Israeli leaders saying, of course we want peace, let's meet and talk. No preconditions. This has been going on for years, by the way, years. No preconditions. But of course, Jerusalem cannot be divided, and of course there'll be no return of refugees, but otherwise no preconditions. And on the Arab side, the Palestinians say, let's meet. No preconditions. Let's meet and talk peace. But of course, Jerusalem must be divided, otherwise we can't meet. And they say, and each side does this. They say no preconditions, and then they lay down conditions. So we don't meet. Now the Americans are having a go. Trump might actually pull it off. He's crazy enough and not enough of an ideologue actually to do something. I think the team he's got looks pretty hopeless to me at this stage. The guy in charge, certainly his son-in-law. But the guy, it's just possible that he doesn't understand the problems and will force through a solution on both sides. Because we've all got to compromise. We've got to back off somewhere. Jerusalem's got to be divided. It's got to happen. There's got to be a compromise on borders. But to do this, you've got to sit down and talk and negotiate. And we're not doing it. Possibly Trump will bring that about now, in which case we'll get somewhere.
But which of the parties do you think will have to go the longest way? Is it equal, or will the Israelis have to go the longest way, or the Palestinians?
we've got the power. We're in the pound seats. We could start making this happen tomorrow. We have the power. We don't want to. We're inching our way towards annexation, which will then start bringing in apartheid. There's no apartheid. There have been movements towards that. About 2 years ago, I think it was, there was suddenly a press story that a new bus service was starting. The army was starting a new bus service, allowing a new bus service from the West Bank, separate, segregated for Arab workers. You know, about 70, 80,000 Arab workers come across each day to Israel to work with permits. An estimated another 10, 15,000 come across illegally and get arrested if they're caught. But each day, 70, 80,000 Arabs come to work in Israel and go back at night. They were going to set up separate buses for them because the settlers were complaining, didn't like their daughters to travel in the same buses as the Arab workers. They said it was dangerous for them. Well, I never heard of a single attack. The Attorney General, when he saw this, he said, no, you can't do this. You haven't discussed it with me. This is illegal. And he stopped it. And as far as I know, it's never happened. That would have been apartheid. Mm-hmm. And you have these situations where the Attorney General, for example, we have a huge case going on at the moment, a very serious case, where the government wants to expropriate, on the settlements over the years, about more than 3,000 houses, Jewish settlers, have been built on private Palestinian land. Some of it, they say, by mistake, others because they couldn't care less, whatever it might be. So the courts are ruling, destroy the houses. They're illegal. The government is now trying to regularize this and put through a law to say that retrospectively, Jews can keep this property and the Palestinians will be compensated. The Attorney General of the government refused to represent the government in this case. That's a democracy. He does not accept it. So the government had to hire private lawyers to argue its case in the Supreme Court last week. If the Supreme Court grants it, that will be a step towards apartheid, because then what you're saying is the Israeli parliament, which has no jurisdiction on the West Bank, has now assumed jurisdiction for people who have got no vote for the Knesset. That's a serious step. So this case is important. We'll see what's going to happen. But the remarkable thing is, no less than the Attorney General, appointed by the government, the top legal man, has refused to represent his own government on it.
But just to sum up, you fear that if occupation continues, it might be a prelude, beginning of a kind of apartheid condition in Israel.
Oh yes, absolutely. That is the great worry.
Yeah.
But in the meantime, it isn't. And I think the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement makes use of this. I think they tell a lot of lies. And I'll give you the biggest one of all, if I can perhaps end off on this point, because BDS has 3 aims, declared aims. That Arabs in Israel must have equality. Well, it's just a nonsense one. I forget the second one. It's return to the 67 boundaries, and yes, okay. Third one is deceptive. It says return of refugees, and that sounds good. It appeals to people. It's a humanitarian appeal. In 48, about 176,000 Arabs remained after the war, and they now number about 1.4 million, and those are the Arabs of today. About 750,000 fled. They either went of their own accord because there was a war, or they were chased out by Israeli troops at gunpoint. Both. 750,000. They are unique. They have a special UN agency to look after them, UNRWA. They are also unique. They are the only refugees among 50, 60 million in the world who are defined not just the original person who lost his or her home or property, but their descendants, including adopted children. So it goes on and on and on without end. There are now anything from 5 to 7, 8 million Palestinian refugees around the world. So when BDS talks about the return of refugees, it's impossible. It's not going to happen. It would wipe out the state of Israel, which is the whole purpose of BDS. And that's what they conceal, because it sounds good, return of refugees. It's not happening anywhere else in the world. But they single out Israel, and they attack us for that. And it's the main deception and lie of the BDS movement.
But you said that your preference would be to end the occupation. And of course, I think the main part of the Norwegian public opinion will totally agree in that. But on the other side, if you are an ordinary Israeli citizen today, and not an intellectual as you are, but a very ordinary Jew living in Israel, and you look at the Middle East in total chaos, in total dissolution, either in states which are in a state of anarchy or under a very hard dictatorship. Don't you think that the natural inclination is to think that we will just stick to what we have? This world is so cruel that we will not change what has worked since 1967.
Sure. Well, I'm not just an intellectual, I'm also a person living there with the same fears and anxieties and family worries as anyone else. Secondly, I come out of South Africa, where exactly the same things were said there. Blacks can't be trusted, blacks will kill whites, blacks will murder all of us. It was all said. I grew up with that. These are fears. And you have the political leaders who feed the fears. That's how they keep in office. I spoke about the blacks in South Africa who are now trying to use racism. We have it on our side. I read stuff of our political leaders and also some of the rabbis, and I'm just dismayed and horrified. It's built on fear. Antisemitism. Antisemitism is real. We know it. America, Britain, and so on. The Jewish organizations, they push anti-Semitism. It's like pressing a button of a cash register. The money comes pouring in for their work. I'll give you one quick example. American campuses. You're reading all the time terrible things on American campuses. Jews can't walk on campuses. Well, I go and lecture there. The Hillel organization takes me there. I've been to 20, 30 in the last couple of years. I've never had any trouble. I get a report, which you can look online. It's, I forget the name, Israel. It's an organization, an American organization, that monitors American universities. There are about 3,500 American universities and colleges. BDS, in a really virulent form, are active on about 4 dozen. Okay? That's how bad it is. It's a problem. It's growing. It's growing because BDS feeds on the ammunition.
BDS is the acronym for
boycott, divestment, and sanctions.
And sanctions. The boycott organization against Israel.
Against Israel. We're feeding the crocodile. We're giving our enemies the ammunition through our occupation and the things that happen there. We're giving them ammunition. So people have got fears. Well, you've got to live. You've got to have a neighbor. If your neighbor's a friend, fine. If your neighbor's an enemy, you've got a problem. So people say Gaza, we can't let go, can't close the encirclement of Gaza, they'll start throwing rockets at us. Well, they're throwing rockets anyway, and every now and again we have a war, and we get hammered internationally for what we do there. And my argument is, if we got out of Gaza totally and we said, look, it's yours. You want a seaport, you want an airport, you want to bring in arms, you do it. You do a single thing to us, and we'll knock the hell out of you. And that time we'll have world behind us because we'll have the right to do it. At the moment, we're a semi-occupier. And that's my cold, I hope, realistic view. You've got to have a neighbor. So you're going to fear the whole neighborhood? I have a friend who came to Israel from South Africa 40 years ago. Served in the army. 67 war, 73 war. Told me he thought, well, he's now ensured there won't be any more war. His son went into the army. Son is now married, going to have a child. So he looks forward to also to the next war. How long do you go on for? These are the people who talk perpetual war. we're always going to be at war. I don't go along with that. And South Africa is my example. Because I said earlier, the end of the Soviet Union made the end of apartheid possible. It was a totally unexpected event. You know, it was inconceivable. Suddenly, overnight, the black people lost the Soviet Union. Military support, money, ideological, total support. Whites lost their support in the West because despite all the sanctions, the whole world was trading with South Africa. The whole world, no question of it. However much the US, Germany, Britain, France said, we're against apartheid, we're in favor of sanctions. Behind the scenes, the West German government was handing South Africa plans to build submarines. Paris was the center of money laundering. It was all done. The end of the Cold War meant that the West no longer feared Soviet intrusion in Southern Africa for the riches of Southern Africa. It's the treasure chest of the world for minerals. And suddenly, they no longer wanted white control only, and they walked away. And blacks and whites suddenly found overnight they had to work together because they didn't have any friends left.
But Iran is still there.
Iran is terrifying, sure.
Yeah.
And no one knows what to deal with it. But if they go too far, they're going to be dealt with. Simple as that. If North Korea goes too far, they're going to be dealt with. It's got to happen.
Thank you, Mr. Pogrund. We have some time for some questions.
Yes. People raise their hands to ask questions. Yeah, first one here, and then number 2, and Mr. Hove, number 3.
Hi. First, I sit here and listen. I grew up in Israel. And I think you say it's no apartheid in Israel. And I think actually it is apartheid in Israel. But only against the Jews. Because Jewish people are not allowed to go to work in Gaza. You just talk about
To work in?
to work in Gaza or to work in the West
Gaza is
Bank.
not Israel.
No, to work in Damascus or Bethlehem and places
sure.
by Arabs. If you go to the Dead Sea, on the way to the Dead Sea, you see a big sign that says Jewish people not allowed to go in. In this area, you might risk.
Israelis, not Jewish people.
Yeah,
It says Israelis.
yeah, Israeli.
Sure. Also Arabs can't get.
What is that?
It's just Israelis. The sign said no Israelis.
It says
For
in Hebrew,
security.
Israeli not allowed to go. You can risk to end your life. Second, you talk about occupation. Now the thing is, in everyone that study psychology, he know that there is something in psychology that people take the result of one thing and make it as a reason to do what they do. So I was wondering first if you're against the occupation, so I wonder if you and other people in the world and talk against occupation, the Norwegian government and everyone, it's also against the occupation on the Negev by the Bedouins that build and build and build, and a few months ago the Israeli come to fulfill the law that they need to put in all people in Israel, and then one soldier get killed and one person get killed, and they do a lot of problems about it. And also, there is occupation on the Golan Heights, for example. Israel occupied the Golan Heights from the Syrian. But if you go back, you ask yourself, why Israel occupied the Golan Heights from the Syrian? And you go back even more, and you find out that because Syria attacked Israel. And the result of it, that Syria attacked Israel, it's Israel occupied the Golan Heights. So why Syria attacked Israel from the first place, before Israel occupied the Golan Heights? And as you can say about all the occupation in the West Bank and everywhere, why it started the occupation? Because all the Arab countries, 6 or 7 Arab countries, attacked Israel out of the blue, and the result of it was that Israel occupied the West Bank, they occupied the place of Gaza. Now, Hamas says that they attack Israel because Israel occupied Gaza before Israel go out from Gaza. We give them Gaza. We go out from there. Why they still attack Israel and shoot rockets? Because after we give them what they says, that's why they attack us. All the occupation in Israel, this is a result of the Arabs attack Israel. It's not the reason.
I got the point. You have a
so much so. Golan Heights, you're quite right, by the way. Golan Heights, I remember going up there years ago and met a man who told me he'd moved his factory up there. I said, why? He said, because where I'm standing, if you put a tank and put it into neutral, you'll roll down the mountainside into Israel. That's why I'm here, to make sure there are no Syrian tanks. That was a good reason. Golan's a different sort of story. Gaza, we haven't left Gaza. That's one of the big myths that the politicians tell you. We should have got out of Gaza. Sharon did the right thing. If Sharon, although he was known as the butcher, in fact, was a very clever politician, had Sharon not unfortunately had the terrible stroke which killed him, he was going to do things. And he was a strong man, and he would have got them accomplished. Sharon, for example, was going to, in the West Bank, he drew a line. He said, on that side, on the east of that line, there are about 70 settlements with 70,000 people. We're getting out. We're going to leave them. They want to come back to Israel? Okay, otherwise it's up to them. On this side, all the settlements and the people, we're going to attach to Israel, and we'll do a land swap with the Palestinians. A matter of negotiation. How much land, which land. Gaza, he pulled out. And you know why? People have forgotten. Go back and look at the records. It was unsustainable. Settlers couldn't move from one settlement to another, not just with an army jeep, with a whole convoy of army to protect them. It had become impossible to live there. That's why Israel got out. And we didn't get out. We should have sat down with the Palestinians and said, we're getting out now, let's work out things. Mosquitoes don't know there's a border. They carry disease. Foot and mouth disease for cattle. You've got to negotiate. You've got to have relations with each other. We got out and closed the place down. We destroyed their airport. We won't allow them a seaport. We control them totally. We have not got out, unfortunately. And the Palestinians on their side were stupid, because when we got out, there were some very thriving greenhouses, a very prosperous industry run by the settlers. A bunch of American Jews put together about $13 million, bought the greenhouses from the settlers and handed them to Palestinians as a gift. They got looted. Within a week, they were destroyed. It was an act of insanity, just hate. So both sides are stupid. That's what I'm saying, basically. There are no angels in that part of the world. We're all stupid. We all do stupid criminal things.
Yes, thank you, sir, for a very good and interesting view of Israel. What I was surprised to hear you say was that your story starts with the 67 war from West Bank. I was wondering, when I have been reading and talking history in Israel, I got to know that 1948, wouldn't that be a better time? Because in 1948, there were the Arab countries coming into the West Bank, and they occupied and they killed all the Jews or threw them out. And they said, this is now Jordan land, and we call it West Bank. Yeah. So all the Jews were thrown out, absolutely 100% out of the West Bank in 1948. There were no Jews living in the West Bank before 1973.
Yeah.
So there is a history, and there was also a history before 48.
Yeah.
Judea and Samaria and Abraham. So it's interesting that you started only with 67 and gave Israel all the blame, because the occupation then is sort of
the
question mark.
occupation started in 67, but 48, you're quite right. There was a very ugly war. It was in a confined space. If you read books, by example, Benny Morris, who's a well-known historian, and he tells, he broke the mold. He's what's called new historians. About 15 years ago, 20 years ago, he started writing, re-examining history and getting access to documents that hadn't been seen before. And if you read Benny Morris, you'll find that in 47, 48, it was a nasty war in which both sides did terrible things to each other. For example, it was in a confined space. You couldn't take prisoners. There's no barbed wire, no place to keep them. You took a prisoner, you killed them, both sides. That lasted for a few weeks or a couple of months. But at the beginning, there was barbarity on both sides. That's an important thing to understand, that we're not perfect. We have an imperfect society, and we've done terrible things. To me, that's part of the necessary recognition of who I am and what I'm doing there. It's part of my belief in Israel, because you've got to stand up and look at what you have done in the past and ensure you don't do it in the future. You had this war. Jews were cleared out of the old city. The old city, every synagogue was knocked to the ground. Not a Jew was allowed. The West Bank got taken over, but the Jordanians did not allow any Palestinian political movement. They suppressed it. There were attempts by Palestinians to create a national movement. Jordanians sat on it. These are the details that are... By the way, I've written most of the stuff in this book, if I may recommend my own book. And in fact, if anyone's interested, the publishers very kindly gave me a few forms. You can get a 30% discount if I can flog this book to you, which will tell you a lot of the details of what you raised. Because this, we did say... But what you're saying is quite right. It's a very complicated situation, the same as you raised. There are all sorts of complications. There are no straight lines. That's why one has moral challenges, because we deal with these situations. You look at Deir Yassin. If you heard the word Deir Yassin was a massacre, I hadn't heard of it until I went to Israel. I've gone into it a great deal, probed it. It was a massacre. The right wing deny it, say it's a total lie. What was a lie, at the time, it was claimed by the Jews, the Irgun, that they killed, I think it was about 170 or 200, I forget, it was somewhere around 200 people. They'd killed 200 Arabs. It was a manufactured figure. And on the Arab side, they took it and circulated it to show how terrible the Jews were. They shot themselves in the foot, because it meant that word went round that these terrible Jews had murdered some 200 Arabs, so Arabs throughout the country started running away to get away from these horrifying Jews. Years later, a Palestinian university researched this and said the figure was no more than about 110. The figure had been wrong from the beginning and had been used by both sides. That's one of the complications of that situation and what has determined people's thinking.
Yes, and when you talk about the wars, there were more wars and more revolts and Arab rage against the Jews than is in almost any history book. So there are lots of things we don't know. I have been to the Hebrew University for a series of lectures as a student, and it was very interesting. So, I'll stop here. Thank you very much for your lecture.
Så siste spørsmål til Hove.
Okay.
Yes. Thank you. As for your last point about Benny Morris, his excellent book about 1948 has been translated into Norwegian by the chairman sitting somewhere. So we are acquainted with it. But I asked for the microphone to thank you for a most interesting contribution to the comparison between the apartheid of South Africa and the accusation against Israel. And I have a specialized question on this possible similarity or dissimilarity. I'm a former editor, so you and I have a colleague in the Jerusalem Post. Her name is Caroline Glick. She is a right-wing commentator. She wrote a book about a one-state solution, arguing that you can't negotiate with Mahmoud Abbas, so you have to impose a solution. As I understood you, your position is moderate left-wing, and you would still prefer a negotiated solution. When I read Caroline Glick's book, I was looking for is there racist motives anywhere in her solution? I guess you may have read her book too, and you haven't. Okay, I was wondering what your impression from.
I look at her columns now and again and just shake my head in disbelief, frankly. Okay. Quite frankly, I think she's just beyond the pale. She's the darling of the extreme right wing. I'm sorry you categorize the moderate left. I'm a journalist. It's basically my situation. I don't go along with her thinking in the slight or thing of prejudices. We've got enough prejudices there. You know, I've gone through South Africa. I saw the terrible things being done there. I saw the nobility of people who resisted and who eventually won. So it's gone into the mud a bit at the moment, but as I was saying, I hope and believe it'll come right. And I see a lot of the same human forces at work where I am now. You've got people who just don't accept other people and who are closed in by fear and prejudice. And I believe you've got to fight them. You've got to open up minds as much as you can. That's been my whole life that I've tried to do in apartheid South Africa and in Israel. I don't believe Israel is apartheid. It just doesn't accord, because I lived through apartheid. It isn't apartheid. The bad things that happen there, as I make clear, the things I dislike intensely. I mean, detention without trial, which was one of the things I wrote most passionately. Any Sunday that I was short of it, I was the chief editorial writer also. Short of editorial, I'll write about detention without trial, just to keep, banging away at the drum. But in Israel, we've got 400 or 500 people detained without trial, and I've got to try and understand that. It's difficult. A lot of moral problems there. But people like Caroline Glick, I don't think add to our solutions. They're simply building up the fears, helping the politicians to build up fear, to build up prejudice, to stay in office. That's what they're trying to do. And if they're more ideological, I'm even more frightened of them, because then it's not just staying in office, they actually have a purpose in life, which I think is going to undermine the existence of Israel. I think we're destroying ourselves through occupation. We're undermining ourselves. How can you go on living, keeping another people pressed down? Once a rabbi I know he used to send me sermons. He sent a sermon saying, the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, has been ours, is ours, always will be ours. It's the standard religious Zionist point of view. So I wrote to him and said, Rabbi, that was a very finely argued sermon, but can you answer a question for me? What are you going to do with the 2.5 billion Palestinians in Judea and Samaria? Are you going to kill them? Are you going to drive them out at gunpoint? Or are you going to give them the vote? And he wrote back to me. You know what his answer was? Quote, that's a real problem, unquote. Okay?
Yeah.
Thank
sure,
you very
it's a problem.
much.
Because the answer should be the vote, which won't be done because that'll destroy Israel as a Jewish state. There is no answer except a two-state solution.
Thank you. I think we need another seminar next year, because there's one aspect that I miss in the entire discussion here. That's the influence of Islam, as Israel is an obstacle to total Islamic dominance in the area. And there is this very mysterious Arab word, W-A-Q-F, waqf, which means that once an area has been inhabited by Muslims, it will forever, or should forever, remain under Muslim control, like Andalusia and not least Judea and Samaria. But this is a whole seminar in itself, I think.
I'll be glad to come back to Bergen.
Yes, thank you.
And we touched into Iran.
Yes, I think we have to stop now because it's 20 minutes before the debate. But the chairman?